Margaret stood at the edge of the cemetery long after everyone else had gone home. Her fingers wrapped tightly around the last, white rose from Henry's funeral bouquet. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying away the final echoes of prayers and condolences. Just 2 weeks earlier she had still been a wife. Someone who belonged to a quiet, steady love that had lasted nearly 4 decades. Now she felt like a stranger inside her own life. Walking through rooms that still smelled like Henry's aftershave and waking up each morning, expecting to hear his gentle voice from the kitchen. Grief had settled over her like a heavy coat she could not remove. The house felt larger, emptier. And every object reminded her the life they had built together brick by brick. Henry's favorite mug still sat beside the coffee machine. His slippers waited by the couch. Even the garden, once a place of laughter and calm evenings, now felt like a silent witness to loss. She had not expected betrayal to follow so quickly behind mourning. The birthday party at Linda's house replayed in her mind again and again. Like a cruel scene from someone else's life. The balloons, the forced smiles, the whispers that stopped when she walked into the backyard. And then Linda's voice rising above everyone, announcing that Tommy was Henry's son, waving that fake will as if it were a sword. At first Margaret had felt nothing but disbelief. The accusation had been so absurd that laughter had threatened to escape her lips, even as her heart pounded with anger. But beneath that shock was a deeper ache. It wasn't only the lie about Henry. It was the realization that her own sister had chosen to hurt her at the worst moment of her life. That night after leaving Linda's house, Margaret had sat alone in her car outside her own driveway for nearly an hour, staring at the front door and gathering the strength to step inside. When she finally entered, the silence greeted her like an old enemy. She walked slowly through each room, touching the back of chairs and picture frames, as if they might disappear. She paused in front of a photo from their anniversary trip to the mountains. Henry's arm wrapped around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something the camera had never captured. "You always said family was complicated," she whispered softly. "But you never imagined this." The next morning she woke early, long before sunrise, unable to sleep. She brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, replaying Linda's words. The lies felt heavy and intrusive, like someone had dragged mud across Henry's memory. He had been loyal, gentle, and fiercely devoted to her. Anyone who truly knew him would understand that. Yet rumors had a way of spreading, and she refused to let those rumors define the man she loved. Days passed slowly as Margaret gathered her thoughts. She walked through the garden each afternoon, finding comfort in routine. The oak tree Henry had planted decades ago cast long shadows across the yard. Beneath its branches she remembered their conversations about life. About children they never had. About dreams that shifted but never faded. They had found peace in each other, even when life had not gone according to plan. Her anger toward Linda came in waves. Sometimes it felt sharp and overwhelming. Other times it softened into a quiet sadness. She thought about their childhood. About the way Linda had always chased attention while Margaret preferred calm stability. They had argued countless times growing up. Yet Margaret had never believed her sister capable of something so cruel. One afternoon, while sorting through Henry's desk drawers, Margaret found an old journal he had kept during his recovery from surgery years earlier. She sat down by the window and opened it carefully, feeling as though she were stepping into a private world. His handwriting flowed across the pages, steady and thoughtful. He wrote about gratitude, about facing fear, and about protecting the people he loved. One entry made her pause. "I worry sometimes that Margaret gives too much of herself to others," he had written. "She believes kindness can fix anything. I hope she never loses that softness, but I also hope she learns to guard her heart." The words filled her with both warmth and resolve. Henry had trusted her strength. He had believed she could stand up for herself when necessary. She closed the journal gently and wiped away tears that had slipped down her cheeks. A week after the confrontation at her house, Margaret decided to visit Tommy. Despite everything that had happened, the little boy remained innocent. She drove to Linda's small duplex with a bag of groceries and a quiet determination to focus on what mattered most. Linda opened the door cautiously, her expression uncertain, as if she were still expecting anger. Tommy's laughter drifted from the living room, and Margaret felt her heart soften immediately. The child reached for her with tiny hands, unaware of the tension between the adults around him. She lifted him gently, breathing in the familiar scent of baby powder and warmth. For a moment, everything felt simple again. Linda watched from the doorway, guilt written across her face. "You didn't have to come," she said quietly. "I came for him," Margaret replied, rocking Tommy gently. "And because I believe people can change if they truly want to." They sat together at the kitchen table, the silence heavy but not hostile. Linda spoke about job applications she had submitted, about counseling sessions she had begun attending. Her voice lacked its usual dramatic edge. For the first time, Margaret sensed genuine vulnerability. Days turned into weeks, and the fragile agreement between them slowly began to reshape their relationship. Margaret helped with practical things, finding affordable childcare options, organizing bills, teaching Linda how to manage a budget. It was not easy. Some conversations ended in frustration. Old habits did not disappear overnight. Yet each small step forward felt meaningful. One evening, while watching Tommy play with wooden blocks on the living room floor, Linda spoke softly. "I used to think you had everything," she admitted. "I never saw the struggles behind your smile." Margaret looked at her sister carefully. "We all carry things others don't see," she said. "But envy blinds us to the truth." Linda nodded slowly, tears glistening in her eyes. "I don't expect forgiveness right away. I'm not sure forgiveness is a single moment," Margaret replied gently. "Maybe it's something that grows over time, like trust." As months passed, Margaret found herself rediscovering pieces of life beyond grief. She returned to teaching part-time, finding comfort in the laughter of children. Her colleagues welcomed her back with warmth, and she realized how much the simple rhythm of a classroom. One afternoon, after school, she visited Henry's grave with fresh flowers. She sat on the grass and spoke aloud as if he were still beside her. She told him about Tommy's first steps, about Linda's progress in counseling, about her own moments of strength and weakness. "I think you knew this storm was coming," she said quietly. "And you trusted me to face it." The wind rustled through the trees, and she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. By the time autumn arrived, the tension that once defined her days had softened into something more manageable. Linda had found steady work at a local daycare center, and Tommy's health had improved. Family dinners became less strained, filled with cautious laughter instead of suspicion. One evening, as they gathered around Margaret's dining table, her parents watched the two sisters carefully. The atmosphere felt lighter than it had in months. Tommy giggled as he dropped pieces of bread onto the floor. And even her father allowed himself a small smile. After dinner, Linda lingered behind while the others left. She stood in the doorway, twisting her hands nervously. "I know I can't undo what I did," she said. "But I'm trying to become someone better than the person who made those choices." Margaret studied her face, searching for sincerity. She saw exhaustion there, but also determination. "Change is hard," she said quietly. "But it's possible." Linda stepped forward and hugged her gently. The embrace felt unfamiliar at first, cautious and uncertain, but Margaret did not pull away. For the first time since Henry's funeral, she felt the weight of anger begin to lift slightly from her shoulders. That night, as Margaret sat alone in her living room, she realized that healing did not mean forgetting. The betrayal would always be part of her story, just as grief would always be part of her heart. But she also understood that love, whether for Henry, for family, or even for herself, was stronger than the bitterness that threatened to consume her. She picked up Henry's journal once more and read his words about resilience. Closing the book, she whispered into the quiet room, "I'm learning, Henry. Slowly, but I'm learning." Outside, the garden swayed gently under the moonlight, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt the faintest sense of hope returning. Not as a loud promise, but as a soft, steady presence guiding her forward into whatever life would bring next. Margaret began to notice that the house no longer felt as suffocating as it had in the first weeks after Henry's passing. The silence was still there, but it was no longer sharp. It had softened into something quieter, something she could live beside instead of fight against. Each morning she opened the curtains and let sunlight fill the living room, reminding herself that time did not stop simply because her heart had been broken. She kept busy with small routines, watering the garden, grading papers in the evenings, calling her parents more often than she used to. And sometimes, when she felt strong enough, she allowed herself to remember Henry without collapsing into grief. She replayed their conversations, his soft jokes, The way he used to hum while fixing things around the house. Those memories had once felt like the knives. Now they felt like anchors. One afternoon Linda arrived unexpectedly, holding Tommy on her hip and a grocery bag in her other hand. Margaret opened the door, surprised but not uneasy. Linda looked tired but calmer than before, her expression less defensive. "I made soup," she said quietly. "I thought you might not have eaten." Margaret stepped aside to let her in. Tommy reached out for her immediately, giggling as if nothing had ever gone wrong between their families. She took him gently, feeling his small fingers curl around her necklace. They sat together at the kitchen table, and for a while neither woman spoke. The quiet between them was no longer heavy with resentment. It felt more like two people learn how to exist again after a storm. Linda finally broke the silence. "I got the job at the daycare," she said. "It's not much money." Margaret smiled faintly. "That's a good start." "I'm trying to be different," Linda continued, her voice trembling. "Some days, I still feel ashamed when I think about what I said about Henry." Margaret lowered her gaze to the table. The pain was still there, but it no longer burned. "You hurt me deeply," she said softly. "But what matters now is what you do next." Linda nodded, tears filling her eyes. She reached across the table, hesitated, then gently placed her hand over Margaret's. The gesture felt fragile, like glass that could shatter if handled too roughly. Yet Margaret did not pull away. Over the next few weeks, their relationship continued to shift. They began meeting for tea once a week, sometimes talking about practical things, sometimes sharing memories of childhood. Tommy grew more comfortable in Margaret's home, crawling across the living room floor and laughing at the old wind chimes near the window. One evening, while sorting through boxes in the attic, Margaret found an old painting Henry had bought for her years ago. It showed a quiet lake surrounded by autumn trees, the water reflecting warm golden light. She carried it downstairs and hung it in the hallway, feeling as though she were reclaiming a piece of herself that grief had hidden away. That same night she sat alone with Henry's journal, rereading the pages that had once made her cry. Instead of sadness, she felt gratitude. He had known her better than anyone else. He had trusted her strength even when she doubted it herself. "I wish you could see how things are changing," she whispered into the stillness. Autumn arrived slowly, painting the trees outside her house in shades of orange and red. Margaret began taking longer walks in the evening, letting the cool air clear her thoughts. She noticed how the neighborhood children rode their bicycles past her gate, how neighbors waved more warmly than before, as if sensing that she had survived something heavy. One afternoon, Linda invited her to Tommy's small playgroup gathering at the daycare. Margaret hesitated at first, unsure whether she was ready to step into a space filled with laughter and young families. But something inside her urged her to go. When she arrived, Tommy ran toward her with open arms, and several of Linda's coworkers greeted her kindly. Watching Linda interact with the children, Margaret felt a quiet pride. Her sister looked different now, less restless, more grounded. Later, as they walked back to the car together, Linda spoke softly. "I used to think happiness came from having more than everyone else. Now I just want peace." Margaret looked at her carefully. "Peace isn't something we find outside ourselves," she said. "It grows when we choose honesty." Linda nodded, absorbing the words. Winter approached, and with it came the anniversary of Henry's passing. Margaret had feared that day for weeks, unsure whether the grief would return as sharply as before. She decided to spend the morning at the cemetery, bringing fresh flowers and a small blanket to sit on. As she stood by his grave, memories flowed freely. She spoke to him about everything that had happened, the betrayal, the healing, the slow rebuilding of family ties. The cold wind brushed against her face, and for a moment she closed her eyes, imagining his steady presence beside her. "I thought losing you would break me completely," she whispered. "But somehow I'm still standing." After leaving the cemetery she returned home, and found waiting on the porch with Tommy bundled in a thick coat. They had brought a small cake and a candle. "We didn't want you to be alone today," Linda said gently. Margaret felt her throat tighten. She invited them inside, and together they sat around the dining table where Henry had once laughed and shared stories. They lit the candle in silence. Tommy clapped his hands at the flickering flame, unaware of the deeper meaning behind the moment. That evening, as Linda prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "I know I can't change the past," she said. But I hope one day you'll trust me again. Margaret considered her words carefully. Trust was not something that returned overnight. It grew slowly, shaped by consistent actions rather than promises. I'm learning to let go of anger, she said finally. That's a start. As winter nights grew longer, Margaret found comfort in simple rituals. She read books by the fireplace, cooked meals she had once made with Henry, and allowed herself to laugh again when Tommy visited. Each small moment felt like a quiet victory over heaviness that had once defined her days. One snowy afternoon, Linda arrived with news that surprised her. I enrolled in evening classes, she said nervously. Child development, I want to build a better future for Tommy. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest. That takes courage, she said. Linda smiled shyly. I learned from watching you. You never stopped growing. Even when life hurt you. Those words stayed with Margaret long after her sister left. She realized that healing was not just about surviving pain. It was also about becoming someone new through it. As spring slowly returned, the garden outside her house began to bloom again. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil. Stubborn and hopeful. Margaret knelt beside the flower beds one morning, planting new seeds where Henry had once worked beside her. The air smelled fresh, filled with possibility. Later that day, Linda and Tommy joined her in the garden. Tommy chased butterflies while Linda helped arrange pots along the walkway. They laughed together when the wind knocked over a small stack of tools, and for a moment the past felt distant. Margaret stood back and watched them, realizing that the life she had feared losing entirely had not disappeared. It had simply changed shape. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she sat alone on the porch and reflected on everything that had happened since Henry's funeral. The betrayal, the anger, the forgiveness that was still unfolding. She understood now that grief and love could exist side by side, shaping her into someone stronger than she had ever imagined. She closed her eyes and whispered softly. I'm moving forward, Henry. Not because I forgot you, but because you taught me how to keep going. The wind carried her words into the quiet night. And Margaret felt a calm certainty settle deep within her heart. As if the next chapter of her life had already begun. Waiting patiently for her to step into it with courage and grace. I remember the way the room felt after Daniel finished speaking. The air was thick. Like no one wanted to breathe too loudly in case the truth shattered again. My sister stood frozen, her confidence draining away piece by piece, yet I felt no triumph, only exhaustion. Grief had already hollowed me out, and now betrayal was trying to live in the empty spaces. People began to whisper. Some moved toward me, touching my arm gently, apologizing without words. Others looked at my sister with quiet judgment. She kept her chin lifted. But I could see the crack forming in her composure. She had walked into that room believing she held power, believing she could rewrite my marriage with a single lie. I stepped outside for air. The evening sky was turning a soft blue-gray, the same color it'd been on the day we buried my husband. I leaned against the railing and closed my eyes, letting the wind brush across my face. For the first time since his death, I didn't feel small. I felt tired but steady. Footsteps approached slowly behind me. I knew who it was before she spoke. You embarrassed me, my sister said quietly. I turned to face her. Her eyes were red, but not from sadness. From anger. From something deeper that I didn't understand. You did that yourself, I replied. My voice surprised me with its calmness. You tried to take my life apart while I was still mourning. She folded her arms defensive. You think you're better than me because you married well. Because he left you everything. He didn't leave me everything because of money, I said. He left me everything because we built it together. For a moment she said nothing. Then her shoulders dropped slightly. I was desperate, she whispered. I thought if people believed the baby was his, maybe things would finally change for me. I stared at her, feeling something shift inside my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet. But a glimpse of the loneliness that had always followed her like a shadow. She had spent years comparing herself to me. Years measuring her life against mine. And somewhere along the way she decided the only way to feel equal was to tear me down. You could have asked for help, I said quietly. She laughed bitterly. You would have pitied me. No, I said. I would have helped you because you're my sister. Silence stretched between us. The kind that carries years of unspoken resentment. She wiped her eyes quickly, refusing to let tears fall. Then she turned and walked away without another word. That night, after everyone left, the house felt enormous and hollow. I walked through each room slowly, touching the furniture we had chosen together. The photos lining the walls. My husband's smile followed me everywhere. I paused in the living room, staring at the last picture we took together. A candid shot of us laughing over burnt pancakes. I hope I handled it right, I whispered to the empty room. The next morning, Daniel called me to review the final documents. We met in his office, sunlight spilling across the polished desk. He handed me a folder and explained that my husband had anticipated conflict after his death. That was why he had written such a detailed will, not out of mistrust, but out of protection. I loved you deeply, Daniel said gently. Everything he did was meant to make sure you would never have to fight alone. Those words stayed with me long after I left his office. Days passed, and the chaos began to fade. Messages from extended relatives slowed. The story of the fake hair became an uncomfortable family memory people avoided mentioning. I focused on rebooting routines: morning coffee on the porch, evening walks through the garden, small moments that felt like stitches closing a wound. One afternoon, a small envelope arrived in the mail. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, my husband's. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a letter he must have written weeks before he died. He talked about ordinary things, how proud he was of the life we had built, how he admired my strength even when I doubted myself. At the end, he wrote something that made my throat tighten. If anyone ever tries to rewrite our story, remember this: you were never just my wife. You were my home. I sat there for a long time, letting the words sink into me. The anger I had carried since the funeral began to loosen its grip. Not disappear, but soften. A week later, my sister showed up at my door. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of her choices had pressed her down. I need to talk, she said. We sat at the kitchen table where my husband and I used to drink tea late at night. She stared at her hands for several seconds before speaking. I lied because I was jealous, she admitted. Not just of you, of how it had anyone look at me like that. Her honesty caught me off guard. There was no performance in her voice this time. Only raw vulnerability. I can't undo what I did, she continued. But I'm sorry. The apology didn't erase the pain. It didn't fix the public humiliation or the weeks of doubt she had created. But hearing her take responsibility shifted something in me. I realized forgiveness wasn't about pretending nothing happened. It was about deciding whether I wanted to carry the anger forever. I don't know if I'm ready to trust you again, I said slowly. But I don't want to keep fighting either. She nodded, relief flickering across her face. We sat quietly. Two sisters who had spent years misunderstanding each other, now trying to find a way forward. Over the next few months, life settled into a new rhythm. I began volunteering at a local community center, something my husband had always encouraged me to do. Helping others filled the long afternoons that used to feel unbearable. Each small act of kindness felt like a conversation with him. A continuation of the compassion he lived by. My sister visited occasionally, sometimes bringing her son. Watching the child play in the garden, I felt a complicated mix of emotions: sadness for the lie that had surrounded his existence, but also hope that he wouldn't grow up carrying the same bitterness that had once driven his mother. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood on the porch and realized something surprising. The grief was still there, but it no longer felt like an anchor pulling me under. It felt like a quiet presence beside me, a reminder of love rather than loss. I thought back to the chaos after the funeral, to the accusations and the cold stares, to the moment my sister had tried to claim a life that wasn't hers. At the time, it felt like the end of everything. But standing there now, I saw it differently. It had been the moment I learned how strong I could be without him physically beside me. The house was still ours. The memories were still alive. And for the first time since he was gone, I allowed myself to imagine a future that didn't betrayal of the past. I went inside, placed his letter carefully in the drawer beside our bed, and whispered softly into the quiet room, "I'm going to be okay."